What happens when ordinary people encounter the impossible in America's forgotten towns? Welcome to Unspoken Fears. Tonight, 10 disturbing stories from Pennsylvania's darkest corners. Stories so unsettling, names and details have been altered to protect those involved, but make no mistake, every event you're about to hear is absolutely real. From impossible geometry that breaks minds to creatures that shouldn't exist, these accounts will challenge everything you believe. Before we begin, drop your location and current time in the comments below. Are you brave enough to listen alone? Like and subscribe now. My name is Chaim. In August 2017, I was a data analyst working remotely from a renovated colonial home in Dillsburg, York County, right off Old Route 15. The house was a dream find, or at least that's what I thought when I signed the lease. Built in the early 1700s, it had been meticulously restored, with exposed beam ceilings and wide plank floors that creaked in all the right ways. The rent was absurdly cheap for what I was getting, nearly 3,000 square feet on 40 acres. The landlord, an elderly man who lived in Harrisburg, seemed eager to have someone in the place. He mentioned the previous owner had been a mathematician who'd lived there for decades before disappearing in 2003. Just walked away one day, he told me. Left everything behind. I should have asked more questions. The oddities started small. I'm a detail-oriented person by nature, comes with the job, so I notice things. The study on the second floor had 7 walls. Not 6, not 8. 7. I counted multiple times, traced my hand along each surface. The geometry didn't make sense. When I tried to sketch it out on paper, the angles refused to add up to what they should. Then there were the doors. The house had 3 doors on the main floor that opened into the kitchen. Sounds normal enough, except they didn't always open into the kitchen. Tuesday morning, the door near the front entrance led to the kitchen as expected. Tuesday evening, same door, I opened it and found myself looking into the basement. I stood there for a full minute, hand on the doorknob, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I closed it, opened it again. Kitchen. I must have been tired, I told myself, working too many hours, staring at spreadsheets. But it kept happening. The door from the hallway would sometimes open to the study, sometimes to a small closet I'd never seen before, sometimes to the kitchen where it was supposed to lead. I started keeping a log, because that's what you do when you're losing your mind, right? You document it. You make it data. Monday, 8 a.m., door A to kitchen. Monday, 2 p.m., door A to study. Monday, 9 p.m., door A to kitchen. There was no pattern I could discern, no time-based logic, nothing that made sense. The house was built before standardized construction, I reasoned. Maybe there were hidden panels, rotating walls, some colonial-era quirk I wasn't understanding. Then I found the notebooks. They were in the study, tucked into a built-in shelf behind a loose panel I discovered while trying to fix a drafty window. 17 leather-bound notebooks, each filled with dense handwriting and geometric drawings. The previous owner's work. His name was written inside the first cover, but I can't bring myself to write it down even now. The drawings were intricate, obsessive, recursive patterns that seemed to fold into themselves, angles measured to 8 decimal places. Equations I didn't recognize, though. I'd taken calculus in college. Page after page of measurements of the house itself. Northeast corner, study, 11:47 a.m., 127.492 degrees. Western wall, kitchen, 3:23 p.m., 94.721 degrees. He'd been measuring the angles of the rooms. For years, apparently. The dates in the notebook spanned from 1987 to 2003. The last notebook was different. The handwriting became erratic, slanting hard to the right, then the left, sometimes barely legible. The angles are changing. One entry read, "Not the measurements. The angles themselves. Space is not fixed here. The house is calculating something. I can feel it thinking." I laughed when I first read that. Nervous laughter, sure, but laughter. Houses don't think. But I kept reading. Saw myself in the study at 3 p.m. I was standing by the window, It's 11 a.m. now. I haven't gone to the study yet today. The house is showing me what will happen, or what might happen, multiple possibilities existing simultaneously. The entries grew stranger. Time is not linear here. It's iterative. We're in a loop, but each iteration is slightly different, variables being tested. I think we're part of an equation. I should have left. I know that now. But I was 3 months into a year lease. I just landed a major contract with a firm in Philadelphia, and the rational part of my brain kept insisting there was an explanation. Maybe the previous owner had mental health issues. Maybe the strange doors were just old construction settling. Maybe I was working too hard and not sleeping enough. I tried to maintain normalcy. I video called with colleagues, went into town for groceries, kept to my routines. But the house had other plans. It started with the time loops. Small ones at first. I'd have a conversation with the mailman at 10 a.m. Then at 2 p.m. I'd have the exact same conversation again. Same words, same inflections, same moment where he'd adjust his cap and comment on the weather. But I remembered the first conversation. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. Déjà vu, I told myself. Everyone experiences it. Except it kept happening. Entire hours would repeat. I'd eat breakfast, work for a few hours, glance at the clock, and see it was 9 a.m. again. The breakfast dishes were back in the cupboard, unwashed. My work files showed no changes from the past few hours. The house was doing something to time. I started keeping detailed logs with timestamps, writing things down on paper because digital records would reset. First instance, 9:15 a.m., made coffee, burned my tongue. Then later, second instance, 9:15 a.m., made coffee, remembered burning my tongue, was more careful. The loops weren't perfect replays. I retained memory across iterations. I was becoming unstuck, experiencing multiple versions of the same time frame. And each time through, I noticed more. The walls would be slightly different colors. The furniture would be positioned inches away from where it had been. Small variables changing. Then I started seeing myself, not reflections. Actually seeing myself in other rooms before I'd entered them. I'd walk past the study and glimpse myself standing at the window, but I was still in the hallway. When I'd enter the study moments later, I'd find myself compelled to walk to that exact window, to stand in that exact position. The house was showing me predetermined points, moments I would inevitably occupy. Free will felt like an illusion. I was following a script I couldn't see, hitting marks that had already been established. The town of Dillsburg itself started changing. Not drastically, but noticeably if you were paying attention. And I was paying attention to everything now. The street layout would be different when I drove to the grocery store. A shop I'd been to the previous week wouldn't exist, replaced by something else that the locals insisted had always been there. That's been a hardware store for 30 years, someone told me, pointing at a building I clearly remembered being a diner. I found receipts in my car from the diner, dated, itemized, but according to everyone in town, it had never existed. I went back to the notebooks, reading more carefully this time. The mathematician had documented the same phenomena. He'd mapped it, tried to create formulas to predict it. The house exists at a junction point, one entry explained. Multiple timelines, multiple possible realities, all converging here. The original structure was built on a site the Lenape avoided. They knew. Colonial records mention it. The place where paths cross. Not physical paths, dimensional ones. He'd gone deeper than I had. He'd found the crawl space. I found it 2 weeks after reading that entry. Behind the study, accessible through a panel that was only visible at certain times of day when the light hit it right. The space was narrow, maybe 3 feet high, extending back into darkness under the eaves. I had to crawl. The smell was overwhelming, like copper and ozone and something else, something that made my sinuses burn. There were instruments back there, copper rods arranged in geometric patterns, crystals suspended on wires, and in the center, a large disc covered in etched symbols. Mathematical notation, I realized. equations carved into metal. The mathematician had built something, or maybe he'd found something and added to it. I reached out to touch the disk. The moment my fingers made contact, I understood. Not intellectually, but deeply, fundamentally. The house wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was functioning. It was a calculator, a massive three-dimensional computational device built into the architecture itself. Every angle, every room, every door was part of a mechanism measuring something, not measuring, processing, working through possibilities. And we, the people who lived here, we were the variables being tested. Different choices, different outcomes, all being calculated simultaneously across multiple iterations of reality. The house was solving an equation, and we were the numbers being manipulated. I pulled my hand back, scrambled out of that crawl space, but the damage was done. Once you understand, you can't un-understand. I started seeing the calculations everywhere. The way sunlight would hit the floor in specific patterns that matched mathematical sequences. The creaks in the floorboards that followed rhythmic patterns, frequencies that corresponded to prime numbers. The entire house was humming with computation, always processing, always calculating, and now I could perceive it. The loops became more frequent. I'd live the same day 3, 4, 5 times, each iteration slightly different. A conversation would go differently. I'd choose tea instead of coffee. The mail would arrive at 10:15 instead of 10:30. Small changes but deliberate. The house was running scenarios, testing variables, and I was trapped in its processing loop. I tried to leave. I packed my car, drove down the long driveway to Old Route 15, turned toward Harrisburg. 2 hours later, I was pulling into the driveway again, unpacking my car. No memory of deciding to return, but knowing somehow that I had to. The house wasn't done with me yet. I'm still here. It's been months now, or maybe it's been years, or maybe it's been days. Time doesn't work right anymore. I've stopped trying to leave. I've started documenting instead, just like he did. I've added my own notebooks to the collection in the study. I measure the angles. I record the loops. I'm beginning to understand what the house is calculating. It's not a math problem in any conventional sense. It's bigger than that. Reality itself is the equation, and this house, this specific point in Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, is where all the possible solutions converge. Every choice anyone could make, every variation of events, they all pass through here, get processed, get calculated. Sometimes at night, I see them. Other versions of myself. The Chaim who left that first week. The Chaim who never found the notebooks. The Chaim who touched the disc and went mad immediately instead of gradually. We're all here, all occupying the same space across different iterations of reality. And the house is comparing us, measuring us, using us to solve whatever equation it's working on. I don't know what happens when it finishes calculating. I'm not sure I want to know. The mathematician's last entry makes sense now. I found it on the very last page of the 17th notebook, written in handwriting so shaky it's almost illegible. It's not a house. It's calculating something. We're the variables, and I think it's almost done. That was written in March 2003, right before he disappeared. It's August 2017 now, or at least that's what the calendar says when it's not resetting. I wonder if I'll still be here in another 14 years, or if I'll disappear too, my calculations complete, my variables no longer needed. I wonder if there's a version of me, somewhere in another iteration, who never came to Dillsburg at all. I hope he's happy. I hope he doesn't dream about 7-walled rooms and angles that shouldn't exist, and the feeling of being trapped inside something vast and mathematical and utterly inhuman. I hope at least one version of me got away. But I don't think any of us did. I think we're all here. We've always been here. And the house will keep calculating until it gets the answer it needs, whatever that answer is, whatever we're solving for. I just hope I'm still human enough to understand it when it's finished. My name is Ania. In November 2009, I was a quality control inspector at a defunct textile mill in Carbondale, Lackawanna County, during its conversion to a plastics manufacturing facility. I had just finished my associate degree, and this was my first real job in industrial safety. The pay was decent, union benefits, and the work seemed straightforward enough. Document the old machinery before removal, photograph everything, make sure the building was up to code for the new operations. What nobody told me was that some of the old equipment had never actually stopped running. The Carbondale mill had been operating since 1880, one of those massive brick structures that defined the town's identity for generations. It employed over 400 people at its peak, churning out textiles for the garment industry up and down the East Coast. When synthetic fabrics killed the market in the 70s, the mill limped along for another 2 decades before finally shutting down in 1991. For 18 years, it sat empty, a decaying monument to industrial decline. Then a plastics company out of Scranton bought it for renovation. That's where I came in. They needed someone to assess the existing structure, catalog what could be salvaged, identify hazards. Night shift paid 20% more, and I needed the money, so I took it. I'd be alone in the building from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, just me and my clipboard and a building full of ghosts. Or so I thought they were ghosts. The first week was uneventful. I walked the floors, took measurements, photographed rusted looms, and silent spinning jennies. The place was enormous, 4 stories of manufacturing space plus a basement that extended under half the footprint. Everything was coated in dust and bird droppings. Pigeons had claimed the upper floors, their cooing echoing through empty spaces designed for the clatter of machinery and human voices. I found old worker manuals, time cards from 1989, a bulletin board still pinned with shift schedules. It was sad more than anything else. All that labor, all those lives spent in service of production, and now it was just emptiness waiting to be repurposed. The basement was different. I saved it for my second week because the stairs down were sketchy, and I wanted to make sure I had proper lighting equipment. When I finally descended, flashlight in hand, hard hat secure, I immediately noticed the temperature drop. It had to be 15 degrees colder down there. My breath came out in visible puffs. The basement had clearly been used for storage and maintenance. Old boilers sat silent in corners. Electrical panels with ceramic fuses lined one wall, and there were filing cabinets, dozens of them, all unlocked. I wasn't supposed to go through documents. That was someone else's job, but curiosity got the better of me. The files were medical records from the 1920s through the 1940s. Workers, compensation claims, injury reports, health assessments. I started reading and couldn't stop. There were photographs, Polaroids, and older film prints documenting what they called textile lung. Workers whose respiratory systems had been destroyed by cotton dust and chemical exposure. But these photos showed something else too. Skin conditions, dermatological abnormalities that looked less like rashes and more like their skin was changing texture entirely. One photo showed a woman's forearm covered in what looked like woven fabric patterns, the skin itself appearing threaded. Another showed a man's hand where the flesh seemed to have a synthetic sheen, like plastic laminate. The captions were clinical. Subject M47, 18 months exposure, dermal integration progressing. Integration with what? It didn't say. I should have reported this to my supervisor, but I wanted to understand what I was looking at first. I brought the files upstairs to the main floor where I had better light and continued reading. The reports detailed a study conducted by the mill's owners in partnership with some chemical company. They'd been testing new fabric treatments, synthetic blends, trying to create materials that were more durable, more resistant to wear, but the workers applying these treatments were getting sick. Not just sick, changed. Their bodies were absorbing the chemicals, and something was happening at a cellular level. The company doctors documented it all with detached scientific interest. When workers complained, they were moved to different positions. When they got worse, they were let go with small settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The day shift supervisor was a man named Dutch, one of those old-timers who'd worked in Carbondale's industrial sector his whole life. He came by one evening just as I was starting my shift, wanted to check on progress. I asked him if he knew anything about the medical study. His face went pale. "You found those files," he said, not a question. "You need to leave those alone. That's old history. Settled lawsuits. Nothing good comes from digging that up." But I pressed him. He finally admitted that some of the day shift workers had been acting strange lately. "They look wrong," he said, struggling for words. "Their skin, their movements, and they won't leave. Even when their shifts are over, they stay. They keep working." I didn't believe him until I saw it myself. I came in early one night, around 10 instead of 11, and the day shift was still there. 6 workers, all moving through the empty mill in synchronized patterns. They weren't doing anything productive, just walking predetermined routes, their footsteps perfectly timed. I called out to them. None responded. As they passed under one of the work lights I'd set up, I saw what Dutch meant. Their skin had a strange quality, almost waxy, with visible texture like woven material. One woman's neck showed clear threading patterns, her skin appearing to be made of interlaced fibers. They moved with mechanical precision, joints, bending at exact angles, no wasted motion. It was like watching automatons programmed to mimic human workers. I followed them, keeping my distance, documenting everything with my camera. They descended to the basement, to a section I hadn't explored yet. The door had been padlocked, but it was open now. Beyond it was another level, a sub-basement I hadn't known existed. The air down there was thick, humid, smelling of machine oil and something organic, something rotting. And I could hear machinery running. Impossible, the building had been without power for years. But the sound was unmistakable, the rhythmic churning of industrial equipment in operation. The sub-basement was a nightmare. The original mill machinery was still there, looms and spinning frames, but they'd been modified, augmented with organic material. Flesh and metal intertwined, pistons pumping in rhythm with what looked like exposed muscle tissue. Gears wrapped in something that resembled human skin. And the workers, they were integrating themselves into the machinery. I watched as one man approached a loom and simply pressed his hands into it. The machine accepted him, his flesh merging with the mechanism, his arms becoming part of the drive system. He didn't scream. His face showed no pain, just blank acceptance. I must have made a noise because they all turned to look at me at once. 6 faces, 6 sets of eyes that reflected light wrong, like polished glass. One of them spoke, but their mouth didn't move correctly. The voice came from somewhere else, maybe from the machinery itself. The work continues. The work never stopped. We are the mill. The mill is us. They started moving toward me, not threatening exactly, but purposeful. I ran. I scrambled back up those stairs, through the basement, up to the main floor. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps perfectly synchronized, never hurrying but never stopping. I made it to the security office and locked myself in. Called Dutch, called my supervisor, called anyone who would answer at 3 in the morning. By the time Dutch arrived an hour later with 2 police officers, the workers were gone. We went down to the sub-basement together. The door was padlocked again. Dutch had bolt cutters. When we got it open and descended, there was nothing. No running machinery. No organic modifications. Just old rusted equipment covered in dust and decay. The police thought I was on drugs or having a breakdown. Dutch looked at me with something like pity. "They showed you," he said quietly. "They don't show everyone. You should quit." But I couldn't quit. Not without understanding. I started researching the mill's history, digging through old newspapers at the public library, talking to retired workers who'd get uncomfortable and change the subject. I found an obituary from 1963 for the mill foreman, a man who'd worked there for 40 years. but several people told me they'd seen him in the mill long after that date. He never left. One old woman told me, the mill became part of him, or he became part of it. When you spend that much time in service to the machine claims you. I went back down to the sub-basement alone one night, determined to document whatever was happening. This time I found them working, all 6 day shift workers, plus others I didn't recognize, some whose clothing looked decades old. They were operating machinery that shouldn't function, producing nothing, just maintaining the motions of production for production's sake. The foreman was there too, or what remained of him. His body was mostly integrated into the main drive mechanism, his torso visible but merged with gears and pistons, his face still recognizable but skin gone synthetic and smooth. When he saw me, he smiled. "The work continues," he said, voice emanating from everywhere at once. "We tried to stop. We wanted to stop, but the mill won't let us. Too many years, too many hours, too much of ourselves given to the machinery. Now the machinery gives back. We're becoming what we always were, components, parts of a larger system. You could join us. The mill welcomes willing workers." 3 of the day shift workers started toward me again. This time I noticed their movements were completely silent despite the concrete floor. They cast no shadows under my flashlight, and I could see through them, just slightly, like they weren't entirely solid anymore. I realized with creeping horror that they were dead, had been dead, but the mill kept them functioning, kept them working, turned them into extensions of itself. The building wasn't just a structure. It was alive in some terrible way, sustained by decades of human labor, fed by the workers who'd given their lives to it literally and figuratively. I set the fire 3 days later, called in a gas leak, made sure the building was evacuated, then torched the sub-basement with every accelerant I could find. The mill burned for 2 days. The plastics company sued me. I lost my job, faced criminal charges that eventually got pleaded down to reckless endangerment. But the mill is gone now. They demolished what remained and built a shopping plaza on the site. Sometimes I drive past it. Sometimes I see people walking through that parking lot with strange gaits, mechanical precision in their movements. Sometimes I wonder if burning it was enough, or if what lived in that mill just moved on, found new machinery to inhabit, new workers to claim. The 3 workers I saw that final night, they never came forward during the investigation. No one has seen them since. No missing persons reports. It's like they never existed outside the mill. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were already gone long before I ever started that job, just echoes of labor playing out in an endless loop, the mill's memory of what it once was and what it will always try to be again. Have you ever worked somewhere that felt alive, like the building itself was watching you? Tell me in the comments what happened. My name is Lane. In March 2021, I was restoring a 1960s AM radio transmitter station outside Wellsboro, Tioga County, for a podcast studio project. I'd been running a true crime podcast out of my apartment for 2 years, building a decent following, and I wanted to upgrade to a proper studio space. When I found the old broadcast facility listed for practically nothing on a rural property auction site, it seemed like fate. The place had been abandoned since 1969, sitting on 12 acres of overgrown land off a dirt road that didn't even have a name, just a route marker. The transmitter tower still stood, rusted but structurally sound. The building itself was a small concrete block structure, maybe 800 square feet, designed to withstand weather and require minimal maintenance. Perfect for conversion. I spent the first 2 weeks just clearing out debris and assessing what could be salvaged. The interior was surprisingly intact. Whoever had shut this place down had left in a hurry. Equipment was still racked and ready, decades of dust coating everything. There were reel-to-reel tape machines, a broadcast mixing board with vacuum tubes, microphones on articulated arms. All vintage, all potentially valuable to the right collectors. I wasn't planning to use any of it. I had modern digital equipment ready to install, but I figured I could sell the old gear to help offset renovation costs. That's when I discovered the equipment wasn't as dead as it should have been. I was photographing the main broadcast console when one of the VU meters twitched. Just a small movement, the needle jumping slightly before settling back to zero. I checked for power sources. Nothing was plugged in. The building's electricity had been disconnected for over 50 years. I touched the meter housing, and static electricity snapped against my fingertip. The whole console was holding a charge somehow. I'm not an electrical engineer, but I know that's not normal. Capacitors can hold charges for a while after power is cut, sure, but not for 5 decades. I made a note to have an electrician check it out before I started any real work. That night, back at my rental in Wellsboro, I couldn't stop thinking about the station. I started researching its history online. The station had operated as WPTG, broadcasting local programming and music, to the Tioga County area from 1952 to 1969. Nothing unusual in the public records. Local news, farm reports, high school sports, the kind of small-town radio that was common before FM took over. But when I dug into newspaper archives, I found something odd. In late 1968, there had been a series of letters to the editor in the Wellsboro Gazette, complaining about the station's broadcasts. People reported hearing strange sounds underneath the regular programming. Voices that weren't part of any show, instructions being given in whispers, and several letters mentioned lost time. People would sit down to listen to the evening news, and suddenly find themselves hours later with no memory of the gap. The station shut down abruptly in February 1969. No announcement, no farewell broadcast, just silence. The FCC license was revoked, but the documentation just said voluntary surrender. I found one more interesting detail buried in a local history blog. 3 families in the Wellsboro area had reported missing time during the same period, weeks in late 1968, where they couldn't account for their activities. They'd go about their daily routines, but have no actual memories of doing so. It was treated as a curiosity, maybe mass hysteria, or carbon monoxide exposure. Nothing conclusive. But all 3 families lived within the broadcast range of WPG. I went back to the station the next day with proper tools and a healthy dose of skepticism. I wanted to see if any of the equipment actually functioned. I brought a portable generator, hooked it up, and carefully powered on the mixing board. The tubes warmed up, glowing orange in their glass housings. The VU meters came alive, bouncing with phantom signals even though nothing was feeding into the board. I put on a pair of old headphones connected to the monitor output. Static, as expected. But underneath the static, something else. Rhythmic pulses. Almost like Morse code, but not quite. And underneath that, if I really focused, voices. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was definitely human speech. Multiple voices overlapping, coming from nowhere. I recorded everything on my phone. When I played it back later, the voices were clearer on the recording than they'd been in real time. I could make out fragments. Remain calm. Continue your routine. You will not remember this. Compliance is necessary. The phrases repeated in loops, slightly different each time, like variations on a script. I sent the audio file to a friend who works in audio forensics. He called me back within an hour, confused. This is weird, man. The voices are there, but they're not on a normal frequency. They're subsonic and ultrasonic at the same time, layered in a way that shouldn't be audible but somehow is. And there's a carrier pattern underneath that looks like it's designed to interact with brainwave frequencies. Where did you get this? I started pulling tape reels from the archive shelves, looking for original broadcasts. Most were labeled with dates and show titles. Morning Farm Report, June 3rd, 1967. Evening News, October 12th, 1968. I picked one at random from late 1968 and threaded it onto a working reel-to-reel machine. The tape was brittle, but playable. A cheerful male voice came through the speakers, announcing local news stories, a church bake sale, road construction on Route 6, high school basketball scores, normal small-town content. But every few minutes, there would be a brief moment of dead air, maybe 2 seconds. And in that gap, the subsonic voices would emerge. Instructions, commands. You are safe. Trust the broadcast. Do not question. It was embedded in every show I checked, hidden beneath the regular programming, designed to go unnoticed by conscious listening but absorbed nonetheless. I needed to understand what I'd stumbled into. I drove into Wellsboro and started asking around at the Historical Society. An elderly volunteer there, she must have been in her 80s, went pale when I mentioned WPTG. "We don't talk about that station," she said quietly. "Bad business. People got hurt." I pressed her for details. She looked around to make sure we were alone, then told me her sister had worked at the station in 1968, in the office doing clerical work. She started acting different that fall. Distant. She'd have these blank spells where she'd just stare at nothing. Then she disappeared for 3 weeks in November. Just gone. When she came back, she had no memory of where she'd been. None at all. She died in 1995. Never remembered those weeks. But sometimes she'd say things in her sleep, stuff about tests and compliance and being a good subject. I tracked down 2 other people who'd lived in the area during that time. Both had similar stories. Family members who'd been avid listeners to WPTG experiencing personality changes, lost time, and in one case, a man who'd driven to a location 40 miles away with no memory of why or how he got there. He'd been found standing in an empty field, confused and disoriented. The common thread was exposure to the broadcasts. The more you listened, the worse the effects became. Back at the station, I found what I was looking for in a locked filing cabinet I'd pried open. Documents. Official-looking paperwork with government seals, though no specific agency listed. Project designations, subject numbers. WPTG had been a test site for something called frequency compliance research. The goal was to determine if embedded audio signals could influence behavior and memory in a civilian population without their knowledge or consent. The station had been provided with special equipment, the broadcasts carefully designed to deliver subliminal commands alongside regular programming. The entire listening area had been an unwitting experimental group. The research notes were clinical and disturbing. Subject pool responding well to extended exposure. Memory suppression achieving 86% effectiveness. Behavioral compliance markers showing positive trend. Recommend expansion to additional broadcast markets. There were tables tracking listener data, maps showing broadcast range, and schedules for different types of embedded commands. Some were simple. Remain calm during civil unrest. Others were more sinister. Report suspicious neighbors. Trust authority without question. It was mass manipulation dressed up as scientific research, and an entire community had been the test subjects. The project had been shut down suddenly in early 1969. Not for ethical reasons, the document suggested, but because the effects were becoming too noticeable. People were complaining. Local doctors were reporting unusual cases of amnesia and dissociation. Someone was asking questions. Better to pull the plug and bury the evidence than risk exposure. The station was abandoned, the equipment left in place because removing it might draw attention. Just lock the doors and let time erase the memory of what had happened here. I sat in that empty broadcast booth surrounded by machines designed to erase memory and reprogram behavior, and I had to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to go public immediately, expose what had been done to those people. But the documents were 50 years old. Most of the victims were probably dead. The perpetrators certainly were, or at least beyond prosecution, and I had no real proof beyond deteriorating papers and audio recordings that could be dismissed as Cold War paranoia or hoaxes. I thought about just walking away, finding a different location for my studio, letting the station rot in peace. But then I noticed something that changed everything. The equipment was still receiving. Even with no power except what I'd provided via generator, the receivers were picking up signals. Modern signals. I isolated the frequency and tracked it. There was an active transmission on the same bandwidth WPTG had used, broadcasting from somewhere within 50 miles. The same subsonic patterns, the same embedded commands, updated for modern concerns, but the same basic structure. Trust official guidance. Maintain social distance. Compliance ensures safety. Someone had revived the program, or maybe it had never really stopped, just moved to different frequencies and different locations. I recorded everything I could. I made copies of the documents. I uploaded encrypted backups to secure servers. Then I called a journalist I'd interviewed for my podcast, someone I trusted to handle sensitive information. I laid out what I'd found, provided the evidence, and waited to see if anything would come of it. The story ran 3 months later in a mid-tier online publication. It got some attention, mostly from conspiracy theorists, but nothing mainstream. The government denied any knowledge of Project Frequency compliance. The FCC had no records of unusual activity at WPTG. Local officials in Wellsboro dismissed it as historical fiction. The story died within a week, buried under the next news cycle. I never did convert that station into a podcast studio. I couldn't bring myself to work in a place that had been used to violate people's minds. I sold the property at a loss to someone who planned to tear it down for the land. Last I heard, they'd changed their mind about demolition. Said the building had good bones, might make a nice artist's retreat. I hope they don't plug anything in. I hope they don't start hearing voices in the static. But sometimes late at night, I'll be driving through rural Pennsylvania, scanning through AM radio frequencies, and I'll catch fragments of something that sounds familiar. Those same rhythmic pulses, those same whispered instructions. And I wonder how many other stations there were, how many other communities were used as test subjects, and whether the program ever really ended or just learned to hide better. Have you ever heard strange sounds underneath regular radio broadcasts or lost track of time while listening to the radio? Drop your experience below. My name is Mac. In June 1998, I was a conservation biology grad student conducting field research in Sproul Forest, Clinton County, studying salamander populations in remote mountain streams. My thesis focused on how isolated populations adapted to specific microhabitats, and Sproul offered thousands of acres of relatively untouched wilderness. I'd secured a research grant that covered a summer of fieldwork, and I was eager to get away from campus, away from people, and just immerse myself in data collection. I established my base camp near the remnants of an old civilian conservation corps site from the 1930s, 7 miles from the nearest forest road. It was perfect isolation, exactly what I needed for focused work. The first week went smoothly. I'd hike out each day to different stream sites, collect samples, document species presence, and return to camp by dark. The forest was dense, second-growth hardwood, the kind of wilderness that feels ancient even though it was logged a century ago. At night, I'd hear the usual sounds: owls, coyotes in the distance, the occasional rustling of deer moving through underbrush. Normal Appalachian forest symphony. But on the 8th night, I heard something that didn't fit. It was a vocalization, definitely animal, but unlike anything I'd encountered in my years of fieldwork. Low frequency, almost subsonic, felt more than heard. It made my chest vibrate. I recorded it on my digital voice recorder, planning to identify it later. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Large, deeply pressed into the soft earth near the stream. They were bipedal, that much was clear. 2 legs, not 4. But the foot structure was wrong for human. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like 3 primary toe impressions and something dragging behind, maybe a dew claw or vestigial digit. The stride length suggested something tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet based on the spacing. I photographed everything, measured carefully, collected a soil sample from one print. I'm a scientist. I don't jump to conclusions. But I also couldn't identify what had made these tracks. Not bear, definitely not human. Nothing in my field guides matched. I found scat about 30 yards from the tracks. Fresh, still slightly warm. The smell was acrid, chemical almost, like ammonia mixed with something organic and rotten. I bagged a sample, wearing gloves, trying not to breathe too deeply. The composition was bizarre when I examined it later. Partially digested plant matter, sure, but also what looked like bone fragments, and something else. Something fibrous that resembled synthetic material, like it had eaten fabric or plastic. That didn't make sense for any native species I knew. Over the next 3 days, I became aware I was being watched. You develop a sense for it when you spend enough time alone in the wilderness. That feeling of eyes on you, of presence just beyond visual range. I'd be working at a stream site and catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I'd turn, nothing would be there. Branches would crack in the forest, too heavy to be small animals, too deliberate to be random tree fall. And at night, the vocalizations continued, getting closer. That subsonic rumble that I felt in my bones before, I consciously heard it. On the 11th night, I saw it. I'd set up a motion-triggered camera near my food cache, concerned about bears. The camera flash went off around 2 in the morning, waking me. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. Standing 30 feet away, illuminated in my beam, was something that shouldn't exist. Bipedal, yes, approximately 8 feet tall. The skin looked wet, almost mucus-covered, dark gray or black, hard to tell in the flashlight. But the head was wrong. No visible eyes, just smooth expanses where eyes should be. But it was clearly aware of me, turning to face me directly despite having no apparent visual organs. The mouth, when it opened, showed rows of thin needle-like teeth, more like a fish than a mammal. And the sound it made, that subsonic rumble, I felt it in my chest cavity, felt my heart rhythm stutter in response. We stayed like that for maybe 15 seconds, though it felt like an hour. Me with my flashlight, frozen in primal fear. It, standing perfectly still, head cocked, as if analyzing me. Then it moved, and the movement was wrong. Too fluid, joints bending in ways that didn't match any vertebrate locomotion I'd studied. It dropped to all fours and vanished into the darkness faster than I could track. I stood there, shaking for another 10 minutes before I could convince my legs to move. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Morning brought a decision point. The rational choice was to pack up and leave. But I'm stubborn, and I wanted evidence. I wanted to understand what I'd seen. I reviewed the camera footage. The creature was there, captured in several frames before it moved out of range. Not clear enough for definitive identification, but clear enough to know it was real. I uploaded the images to my laptop, backed them up on multiple drives. Then I started searching the area systematically, looking for more signs, more evidence of what this thing was. I found its den, or what I thought might be a den, in a rock outcropping about a mile from camp. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for something that size to squeeze through, but inside it opened into a larger cavity. I could smell it before I saw anything, that same ammonia chemical stench. I didn't go in, I'm not that reckless, but I used my camera with a telephoto lens to photograph the interior. There were remains inside, deer bones scattered and gnawed, but also other things, pieces of backpacks, a hiking boot, a water bottle with a logo from an outdoor gear company, evidence that this thing had encountered humans before, and the encounters hadn't ended well. I was packing up my camp that afternoon, deciding that discretion was indeed the better part of valor when Amos arrived. He was my research partner, a fellow grad student who'd been handling the lab work back at the university. He'd driven up to bring me some additional sampling equipment and check on my progress. I'd never been so glad to see another human being. I showed him everything: the tracks, the photos, the footage, the den site. Amos was skeptical at first. Thought maybe I'd been in the woods too long, letting isolation mess with my perceptions. But then we heard it. Middle of the afternoon, sun still high, and that subsonic vocalization rolled through the forest. Amos went white. "What the hell was that?" he asked. I told him we needed to leave, immediately. We were breaking down the last of the camp when it appeared again. Daylight this time, no shadows to hide in. It emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away, moving with that disturbing fluidity. Amos fumbled for his camera. I grabbed my bear spray, knowing even as I did that it was probably useless. The creature approached slowly, deliberately. It seemed curious rather than aggressive, but there was intelligence in its behavior. Problem-solving intelligence. It circled our camp at a distance, stopping occasionally as if examining our equipment, our supplies. Then it did something that still haunts me. It vocalized, but this time it wasn't that subsonic rumble. It was words. Garbled, distorted, but recognizably human speech. It was mimicking us. Phrases I'd said into my voice recorder over the past week, played back in a grotesque approximation of my own voice. Amos broke first. He ran for his truck, parked on an old logging road a quarter-mile away. I grabbed what I could carry and followed. The creature paced us through the forest, not chasing exactly, but keeping parallel, maintaining visual contact. When we reached the truck, fumbling with keys, dropping equipment in our panic, it stood at the tree line and watched. Just watched. We threw our gear in the bed and drove. Didn't stop until we hit the ranger station at the forest boundary. We reported it, of course. Filed an official report with the Forest Service, described what we'd seen. They were polite but clearly skeptical. Sent a ranger out to investigate. He found our abandoned camp, found the tracks, but said they could be faked. The photos were dismissed as inconclusive. Probably a bear, they said. Perspective and lighting can be tricky. They refused to close the area to hikers. We were just grad students with overactive imaginations, stressed from isolation, misidentifying wildlife. The official report was filed and forgotten. Amos wanted to go back, wanted to mount a proper expedition with better equipment, proper documentation. We argued about it for weeks. I refused. Not because I didn't want evidence, but because I'd seen something in that creature's behavior that terrified me more than its physical appearance. It had been learning our routines, our voices, our patterns. It was studying us, the way we study animals in the wild. And I had a horrible suspicion about what it was. I started digging through old Forest Service records, historical documents, anything I could find about Sproul State Forest. I found references to a facility, unofficial, never on any public maps, built in the early 1960s, operated by some division of the Department of Defense. The records were heavily redacted, but I could piece together enough. It had been a research site, biological research, something about genetic modification, hybrid species, attempts to create organisms adapted for extreme environments. The facility was decommissioned in 1967, officially closed and cleaned up, but there were incident reports, carefully worded to obscure meaning. Specimen containment failure. Breeding population established in surrounding forest. Recommend continued monitoring but no public disclosure. They'd created something, some kind of hybrid organism combining traits from multiple species, maybe incorporating synthetic biology elements, and they'd lost control of it. Instead of admitting the failure, they'd buried the facility, buried the records, and left whatever they'd created to survive in the wilderness. For over 30 years, these things had been living in Sproul State Forest, adapting, maybe even evolving. And we'd stumbled into their territory. 3 weeks after we left the forest, Amos went back. He went alone, didn't tell me until after he'd already left. He wanted definitive proof, wanted to force the authorities to acknowledge what was out there. I got a voicemail from him the first night. He'd found the den again, set up cameras, was planning to wait and document whatever returned. That was the last I heard from him. Search and rescue found his truck a week later, found his camp, found his equipment. But Amos was gone. They searched for 10 days, brought in dogs, used helicopters. Nothing. He'd vanished completely. Except he hadn't. Not completely. 4 months later, a hunter called in a report. He'd seen someone in the deep forest, moving strangely, acting disoriented. Rangers investigated and found Amos, or what was left of him. He was alive, physically intact, but changed. His skin had taken on a grayish tone, almost waxy in texture. His body temperature was wrong, hypothermic, but he wasn't shivering, wasn't showing any signs of distress. And he had no memory of the missing time. No memory of what happened during those months in the forest. But he'd developed photosensitivity, couldn't tolerate bright light. His dietary preferences had changed, couldn't stomach cooked food anymore, only raw meat. And sometimes, late at night in the hospital, nurses reported hearing him make sounds that weren't quite human. The doctors couldn't explain it. Neurological tests came back normal. Physically, he was fine, except for the temperature regulation issues and the skin changes. They called it idiopathic, which is medical speak for we have no idea what's wrong. I visited him once. He looked at me with eyes that didn't quite focus correctly and asked me if I remembered what we'd found in the forest. I told him yes. He smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I've ever seen because it wasn't quite a human smile anymore. It wanted to understand us, he said. So it did. Now I understand it. Fair trade, don't you think? I left biology after that. Couldn't continue with fieldwork. Couldn't look at wilderness the same way. I teach high school science now, safe in a classroom, far from places where things we created but don't understand might still be living, still adapting, still learning. Amos is in a long-term care facility. Not because he's dangerous, but because he can't function in normal society anymore. He's something between what he was and what found him in those woods. And sometimes I wonder if that was always the risk, that whatever we create in our hubris to master nature will eventually master us instead. If something in the wilderness started mimicking your voice, would you stay to investigate or run? Drop your answer below. My name is Annalise. In September 2014, I inherited my grandmother's property near Latonia, Columbiana County, 40 acres bordering state game lands with a hand-dug well from the 1800s. I'd never been particularly close to her, maybe saw her 3 times in my adult life, so the inheritance came as a surprise. My parents had distanced themselves from that side of the family years ago, something about old disputes and different values, the usual rural family drama. But the property was mine now, free and clear, and I was between jobs and relationships, so I figured why not spend a few months fixing it up to sell. The house was small but solid, Diane stone foundation, the kind of construction that lasts centuries. And the land was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in maple and oak, a creek running through the back 40. It seemed like a peaceful place to reset my life. The locals in Latonia were friendly enough when I stopped at the general store for supplies. But when I mentioned I was moving into the old Hirschberger place, the conversations would stop. People would find excuses to end the interaction. Sudden remembering of appointments or tasks that needed attention. One older farmer, loading feed into his truck, finally gave me a warning. "You keep that well maintained," he said, not looking at me directly. "The blessing needs renewal. Your grandmother knew. You'll need to learn." I asked him what he meant by blessing. He just shook his head and drove away. The well was in the side yard, a circular stone structure about 4 feet across with a wooden cover and a manual pump that surprisingly still worked. The water ran clear and cold when I tested it, better than any municipal supply I'd tasted. I had it tested at a lab in town, Wanted to make sure it was safe. Results came back perfect. Better than perfect, actually. The mineral content was ideal, pH balanced, no contaminants. I started using it exclusively for drinking and cooking. Best water I'd ever had. 3 weeks into my stay, I started noticing the changes. Small things at first. The water's temperature would fluctuate wildly from one pump to the next. Ice cold one moment, then lukewarm, then cold again, with no logical pattern. The color would shift too, usually crystal clear, but occasionally taking on a dark amber tint, like tea-stained, though it would clear up if I let it sit. And sometimes, I swear sometimes, the water in my glass would move against gravity. Just slightly, just enough to notice. A ripple moving upward instead of settling down. I convinced myself it was vibrations from the old house settling, wind creating pressure changes, anything rational. Then the neighbors started visiting. Not social calls exactly, more like inspections. 4 different families over the span of a week, all finding reasons to stop by. Bringing welcome casseroles, offering to help with repairs, but really they were checking on the well. They'd walk around it, touch the stones, peer into the depths. One woman, maybe in her 60s, asked me outright if I'd fed it yet. I laughed, thought she was joking. She didn't laugh back. Your grandmother fed it every month, kept things balanced. You need to continue the tradition. I asked her what she meant by feeding a well. She just said I'd figure it out when the time came and left without touching the casserole she'd brought. I called my mother that night, asked her about the well, about family traditions I should know. She was silent for a long moment. Then she told me to sell the property and leave. Immediately. Don't ask questions, just go. When I pressed her, she hung up. That's when I knew something was genuinely wrong. My mother doesn't scare easily, and I'd heard fear in her voice. The livestock started dying on the 4th week. Not my livestock, I didn't have any, but the neighboring farms. Cows, chickens, even a few horses. No apparent cause. They'd just be found dead in the morning. No signs of disease or injury. The vet who examined them was baffled. It's like they just stopped, he said. Hearts quit beating, lungs stopped processing air. Everything just shut down simultaneously. And the pattern was clear if you looked at a map. The deaths radiated outward from my property in a rough circle, getting worse the closer you got to my land. Then the crops started failing. Green fields turning brown overnight. Plants withering from the roots up. Wells on neighboring properties went bad, water turning foul and undrinkable. But my well, my grandmother's well, it kept running clean and cold and perfect. Too perfect. I started to understand that perfection was the problem. This well was taking from everything around it, concentrating all the vitality and health into itself while draining the surrounding land. The township called a meeting. I wasn't officially invited, but I showed up anyway. 30 or 40 people packed into the community center, and every single one of them knew why they were there. The well. My well. They were polite about it at first, talking around the issue, discussing the mysterious blight affecting the area. But eventually, the oldest man in the room stood up and addressed me directly. Your grandmother maintained the covenant. Every 7 years, a renewal. Every month, a smaller offering. She died 7 years and 2 months ago. The well is hungry. It's taking what it needs because you haven't given it what it's owed. I demanded answers. What covenant? What offering? He sighed like he was explaining something to a stubborn child. The well wasn't just a water source. It connected to something deeper, something that lived in the aquifer beneath all their properties. Their ancestors, settlers in the 1790s, had made an agreement with it. Water that never ran dry, land that stayed fertile, protection from disease and disaster. In exchange, they fed it, kept it satisfied. Every family with land touching the aquifer shared the responsibility, rotating the offerings, maintaining the balance. My grandmother had been a keeper, one of the primary caretakers. Now that role had fallen to me. I asked what I was supposed to feed to an underground water source. The old man's face was grim. Life, he said simply. It needs to consume life to sustain the life it provides. Your grandmother used livestock usually. A calf every month, a larger animal for the 7-year renewal. Humane as possible, quick and clean, but it has to be living when it goes down. The well needs the essence, the energy. Blood and bone aren't enough. I told them they were insane. This was the 21st century. We don't sacrifice animals to appease underground monsters. I'd fill in the damn well, cap it, drill a new one if I needed water. They looked at me with pity. You can't stop it, a woman said. It's been feeding for over 200 years. It's part of the land now, part of the water table that supplies this entire township. You deny it. It takes what it needs anyway. It'll take more than animals eventually. Already started, hasn't it? The livestock dying. That's it feeding itself because you haven't provided. I left that meeting determined to prove them wrong. I called the state EPA, reported a potential aquifer contamination, called the Geological Survey, requested a study of the underground water systems, called every authority I could think of. Most didn't return my calls. The few who did said they'd look into it but clearly thought I was wasting their time. One hydrogeologist actually came out to the property, took samples, ran tests. His equipment kept malfunctioning near the well. Sensors giving impossible readings, GPS devices losing signal, even his truck refusing to start until he'd walked 100 yards away from the well. He left without completing his assessment, told me the property had some kind of electromagnetic anomaly that made accurate testing impossible. I tried to cap the well myself, bought concrete, lumber, all the materials I'd need to seal it permanently. The night before I planned to start, I had a dream, or I thought it was a dream. I was standing beside the well, and I could see down into it. Down and down and down, far deeper than any hand-dug well should go. And at the bottom, something vast was looking back up at me. Not eyes. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its attention like physical pressure. It showed me things. The history of the land, the agreement made, the families who'd prospered, and the families who'd broken the covenant, refused to feed it. I saw their farms failing, their children sickening, their livestock perishing. I saw the community come together and force compliance because one family's refusal endangered everyone. I woke up knowing I'd been given a choice, but not really a choice at all. Refuse and watch everything around me die while the well sustained itself on stolen life force. Comply and become part of something ancient and terrible but functional. A parasite that had been integrated into the ecosystem so thoroughly that removing it would kill the host. The old farmer, who'd warned me that first day, he showed up the next morning with a calf in a trailer. "I'll help you the first time," he said. "After that, you're on your own. It's your responsibility now." I wanted to refuse. Every moral fiber in my body screamed to refuse, but I'd seen the dead livestock. I'd seen the failing crops. I'd seen the fear in my neighbors' eyes. They were good people trapped in an impossible situation, dependent on something that demanded a horrible price. The process was worse than I'd imagined. The calf, innocent and trusting, led to the well, a ramp constructed to walk it down into the shaft. It didn't want to go, sensed something wrong, but we forced it. And at a certain depth, something took over. The calf stopped struggling, went calm, almost peaceful. Then it just walked deeper into darkness, and I heard the water surge, heard something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been my imagination. The farmer pulled up the ramp. "Once a month," he reminded me, "keeps the rest of the community safe. Your grandmother did this for 40 years. Now it's your turn." I'm still here, still maintaining the property, still performing the monthly ritual that my rational mind can't accept, but my experience knows is necessary. I've tried to leave twice, made it as far as Pittsburgh once before. I felt the pull, The certainty that if I didn't return, something terrible would happen, not just to the property, but to everyone who depended on the aquifer. I'm trapped by responsibility, by the weight of collective survival, resting on my willingness to do something monstrous. The well runs, clear and cold. My neighbors' crops are thriving again. The livestock are healthy. And once a month, I lead something living down into the darkness and try not to think about what I've become. A keeper of something ancient, a participant in a cycle I don't understand. My grandmother did this for decades. The families before her did it for generations. And now it's my burden, my terrible inheritance that came with 40 beautiful acres and a water source that should never run dry. Would you continue a dark family tradition to save your community, or refuse no matter the cost? Tell me what you'd do. My name is Alexandria. In February 2019, I was a single mother working night shifts as an ER nurse in Honesdale, Wayne County, hiring a local teenager to stay overnight with my 2 kids. Finding reliable childcare for overnight hours is nearly impossible, especially in a small town where most babysitters want typical evening gigs that end by midnight. But I needed someone from 10 at night until 7 in the morning, 3 nights a week, and I was willing to pay well for it. That's when I found Briar. He answered my post on the community Facebook page within an hour, said he was 18, a senior at the local high school, and didn't mind overnight shifts because he was a night owl anyway. His references checked out perfectly. 2 families in Honesdale gave glowing reviews. Responsible, great with kids, always punctual. He seemed like the answer to my prayers. The first month went smoothly. Briar would arrive at 9:45, giving us time to go over the evening routine. My daughter Sophie was 7. My son Ethan was 4. Simple kids, easy bedtime at 8:30, and they usually slept through the night. Briar's job was essentially to be present in case of emergency, make sure the house didn't burn down, and be there when they woke up if I was running late from my shift. He was polite, clean-cut, always had his homework with him to work on during the quiet hours. The kids liked him immediately, which isn't always easy with Ethan, who's cautious around new people. Everything seemed ideal. Then I started noticing small things. Nothing alarming at first, just odd. I'd come home and find objects moved slightly. The coffee maker unplugged when I always left it plugged in. Picture frames on the mantel repositioned. Still the same photos, but facing slightly different angles. Books on the shelf rearranged. I thought maybe I was misremembering, working too many overnight shifts, exhaustion playing tricks with my memory. But it kept happening. Every shift I worked, I'd return to find tiny changes throughout the house. Never anything missing, never anything broken, just rearranged. I mentioned it to Briar one morning, casual, not accusatory. "Hey, do you move things around while you're here, like organizing or cleaning?" He looked confused, said he tried not to touch anything except what was necessary for the kids. Maybe Sophie was getting up at night and playing, he suggested. But Sophie was a heavy sleeper, always had been, and these changes were too deliberate, too systematic. Someone was going through my house with purpose. The kids started saying strange things. Sophie mentioned that Briar acted different after they went to sleep. "Bedtime Briar is nice," she said one morning over cereal. "But morning Briar is different. He doesn't smile the same way." I asked what she meant. She shrugged, 7-year-old logic struggling to articulate something she sensed but couldn't explain. Morning Briar's eyes are wrong, like he's thinking about stuff that bedtime Briar doesn't think about. I chalked it up to childhood imagination, that tendency kids have to create narratives around ordinary things. But then Ethan said something similar. He woke up one night needing water and found Briar standing in the hallway, just standing there in the dark, not moving. He was looking at the pictures on the wall, Ethan told me, but his lips were moving like he was talking, but no sound was coming out. And when I said his name, he didn't hear me for a really long time. Then he got me water, but he didn't say anything, just smiled weird. I decided to install a nanny cam, Nothing elaborate, just a simple wireless camera in the living room, angled to catch most of the main floor. I didn't tell Breyer about it. Wanted to see his natural behavior when he thought he wasn't being watched. I felt guilty about the deception, but my kid's safety trumped everything else. That first night with the camera running, I checked the footage during my lunch break at the hospital. What I saw made my blood run cold. Breyer's behavior until the kids went to sleep was normal. He helped Sophie with a puzzle, read Ethan a story, got them both settled into bed. Then he came downstairs, pulled out his laptop, appeared to be doing homework. Standard babysitter activity. But around 11:30, something changed. He closed the laptop, stood up, and began systematically going through my house. Not searching like he was looking for something specific. More like he was documenting. He'd pick up objects, examine them closely, sometimes talking to himself, though no sound came through the camera's audio. He opened drawers, photographed contents with his phone. He went through my mail on the kitchen counter, reading each piece carefully. He opened the coat closet and inventoried what was inside, actually counting coats and taking notes. The most disturbing part was when he stood in front of the mirror in the hallway. He stared at his own reflection for nearly 10 minutes, completely motionless. Then he started talking to himself, and this time the audio picked it up. He was rehearsing conversations, different versions of the same interaction. "Hi, Mrs. Alexandria. Everything went great tonight." Said 5 different ways, with different inflections, different facial expressions, like he was practicing being normal, testing which performance worked best. Then he practiced other scenarios. The kids were wonderful, no problems at all. Sophie asked about her father. I redirected the conversation. Ethan had a small nightmare, but I calmed him down. He was creating a script, preparing responses to questions I hadn't asked yet about situations that hadn't occurred. I confronted him the next morning, carefully. Didn't mention the camera, just said I'd noticed he seemed distracted lately. Was everything okay? His response was perfectly calibrated. Concerned but reassuring, apologetic but not defensive. "I'm so sorry if I seemed off, Mrs. Alexandria. I've been stressed about college applications. I promise I'm focused when I'm here with Sophie and Ethan." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't seen the footage, I would have believed him completely and felt bad for even questioning. I started digging into his background more thoroughly. Called the references again, the 2 families who'd recommended him so highly. One number was disconnected. The other, when I finally reached them, had no idea what I was talking about. "We never employed a babysitter named Breyer," the woman told me, "and we certainly never gave a reference. Are you sure you have the right number?" I checked my notes. It was definitely the number Breyer had provided. Either he'd given me a fake number, or someone had been impersonating references when I'd called to check. I searched for him on social media, found 3 profiles with his name, all with different last names, all in towns within 50 miles of Honesdale. Different profile pictures, but similar enough that they could be the same person. Each profile claimed to be 18, senior in high school, interested in childcare and education. Each had posts about babysitting jobs, asking for recommendations, offering services, but the timelines didn't match. If these were all the same person, he'd been babysitting in multiple towns simultaneously, which was impossible. I installed more cameras, one in the kitchen, one in the upstairs hallway near the kids' rooms. The footage from the next shift was worse. After the kids were asleep, Breyer spent 2 hours going through everything in my house, not just casual browsing, systematic invasion. He photographed documents, my nursing license on the wall, school papers from the kids' backpacks. He opened my laptop, and I could see him scrolling through files, though I couldn't make out what he was accessing. He went into my bedroom, opened drawers, looked through personal items, and the whole time, he was taking notes on his phone, documenting everything. Around 3 in the morning, he made a phone call. I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but his side was chilling. "Yeah, the layout is standard. 2 bedrooms upstairs, master on main floor. Kids or deep sleepers wouldn't be an issue. Front door is the weak point, standard deadbolt. Back door has a chain, but it's flimsy. Windows are old, single pane. Neighbors are far enough away that noise wouldn't be a concern. He was casing my house, providing intelligence to someone else, planning something. I ended his employment immediately the next morning, told him I'd found alternative child care, paid him for the final shift, and made it clear his services were no longer needed. His reaction was interesting. No surprise, no disappointment, just acceptance, like he'd expected it. Of course, Mrs. Alexandria, I understand. If you need references for your new sitter, I'm happy to provide them. Even at the end, maintaining the performance, offering to help. I told him that wouldn't be necessary and asked him to leave. He smiled, that same calibrated smile I'd seen him practice in the mirror, and left without another word. I reported everything to the Onsdale police, showed them the footage, explained my concerns. They took a report but said unless he'd actually stolen something or made a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. Sounds like a creepy kid, the officer told me. But being weird isn't illegal. Keep your doors locked, maybe get a security system. I already had cameras, I told him. He suggested an alarm system too, something that would alert me and the police if someone tried to enter when I wasn't home. 2 weeks later, I found out I wasn't the only one. A woman in nearby Hawley posted in a local Facebook group about a babysitter who'd made her uncomfortable, described behavior similar to what I'd experienced. Systematic searching, too much interest in the home's layout, different demeanor when he thought no one was watching. She'd fired him too. Then another woman in Lakewood responded to that post with an identical story. Same age range, same general appearance, different name. We compared notes. The descriptions matched Breyer perfectly, but he'd been using different names, different references, different backgrounds. Same person, multiple identities. We tried to find him, tried to warn other parents. But his social media profiles had disappeared. The phone number I had for him was disconnected. The address he'd provided turned out to be a vacant lot. It was like he'd never existed, except for the footage I had and the memories of his presence in my home, going through my life, documenting everything for purposes I could only guess at. The theory we developed was terrifying. He wasn't a babysitter. Or he was, but that was just his access point. He was part of something larger, some kind of organized group infiltrating homes, gathering information, preparing properties for future crimes. Burglaries, maybe. Or worse. The detail in his documentation suggested professional operation. The multiple identities suggested coordination. And the fact that he'd done this in multiple towns meant there were likely others doing the same thing, building a database of vulnerable homes and families. I've moved since then. Different town, different job, different life. I never hire babysitters anymore, rely on daycare and family friends, people I've known for years. But sometimes I wonder how many other families he documented, how many homes he mapped, and what the end game was. Were they planning break-ins, kidnappings, something I couldn't even imagine? I reported everything to state police, to FBI field offices, to anyone who would listen. Some took me seriously. Most treated it like paranoid overreaction. But I know what I saw. I know he was preparing something, and I know there were others involved. The worst part is not knowing. Not knowing if he's still out there, using different names, infiltrating different families, not knowing what information he gathered or what he plans to do with it, not knowing if one night I'll wake up to someone who knows the exact layout of a house I no longer live in, trying to execute a plan they prepared months ago. Trust, once broken that completely, never fully repairs. If your babysitter knew every detail about your home and family, what could they do with that information? Share your thoughts below. My name is Carmelo. In January 2024, I was a highway maintenance supervisor caught in a freak ice storm near Smethport, McKean County, Route 6 closure, forcing me to shelter in an abandoned gas station. I'd been with Penn Doughty for 12 years, seen plenty of winter weather, thought I'd experienced every variation of Pennsylvania cold. I was wrong. What happened that night defied every natural weather pattern I understood, and I'm still not convinced I survived it. Sometimes I think I'm still in that gas station, frozen in a moment that never ended, and everything since has been my mind creating an escape that never actually occurred. The forecast had called for light snow, maybe 2 inches, nothing the plows couldn't handle. I was doing a routine inspection run along Route 6, checking road conditions, making sure the brine trucks had adequately pre-treated the surface. It was around 4 in the afternoon when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, like normal weather systems. It plummeted. My truck's external thermometer showed 38 degrees, then 20, then 0, then negative numbers, all within the span of maybe 10 minutes. I'd never seen anything like it. The sky turned a weird, gray-green color, clouds moving in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost geometric. Then the ice started. Not freezing rain, not sleet, solid ice, forming instantly on every surface. The road disappeared under a sheet of it, perfectly smooth, perfectly clear. My truck lost traction immediately. I managed to slow down without spinning out, but I couldn't maintain control. The ice was accumulating at an impossible rate, building up on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, coating the hood, the mirrors, everything. Within minutes, I was driving blind through a wall of ice with visibility down to nothing. I saw the gas station through a brief, clear spot in the windshield. One of those old, independent places that had gone out of business years ago, buildings still standing but windows boarded up. I managed to get the truck into the parking lot, sliding the last 20 feet, and barely got the door open before ice started forming on the hinges. The cold was physical, not just temperature, but pressure, like the air itself was solidifying. My breath froze before it left my mouth, ice crystals forming on my lips, in my nostrils. I ran for the gas station, breaking through the front door, old wood splintering easily. Inside was dark and cold, but marginally better than outside. I used my flashlight to survey the space. Standard gas station layout, front retail area with empty shelves, back office, small bathroom, storage room. Everything covered in dust and decay, but the structure was sound. I tried my radio, my cell phone, the emergency beacon in my truck. Nothing worked. The ice storm was creating some kind of interference, blocking all signals. I was cut off completely. I went back to the truck to grab supplies before the ice made it impossible. Emergency kit, flares, thermal blankets, the portable heater I kept for situations like this. The ice had already accumulated 3 inches on every surface, and I could hear it forming, a constant crackling sound like breaking glass in reverse. The truck was encased. In the 15 minutes I'd been inside, it had become a sculpture of ice, every detail preserved but completely inaccessible. I got what I could carry and retreated to the gas station. That's when I found the bodies. Not bodies, that's not accurate. Frozen people. In the storage room, 3 of them, positioned like they'd been trying to hide. 2 adults and a teenager, huddled in the corner, perfectly preserved in ice so clear I could see every detail of their faces. Their expressions weren't peaceful. They were terrified, eyes wide, mouths open in screams that had frozen mid-sound. And they weren't old, not decades-old victims from when the station closed. Their clothing was recent. Winter gear from maybe 5 or 10 years ago. The ice encasing them wasn't dusty or clouded. It was pristine, like it had formed yesterday. I checked for any identification, any way to figure out who they were. Found a wallet in one of the men's pockets, visible through the ice. Pennsylvania driver's license, expired 2019, so they'd been here at least 5 years, frozen in this storage room, and nobody had found them. Or maybe people had found them and the ice had claimed them too, and their bodies were somewhere else in this building or in other shelters along Route 6, an accumulating collection of victims nobody knew about. The temperature inside the building was dropping. I could see my breath, could feel the cold seeping through my layers of clothing. I set up the portable heater, but it barely made a difference. The propane burned, heat radiated out, but the cold absorbed it almost immediately. It was like the cold was active, intelligent, consuming warmth as fast as I could generate it. I wrapped myself in thermal blankets and tried to think rationally. Storm would pass, temperatures would rise, rescue crews would come looking for me once I didn't check in. Standard survival protocol, wait it out. But the ice kept forming. On the windows, on the walls, on the floor. It was growing from the inside, not just accumulating from outside. I watched it spread across the concrete floor in crystalline patterns, beautiful and terrifying, moving in directions that didn't follow any logic of water freezing. It moved toward heat sources, moved toward me. I relocated to different parts of the building, trying to stay ahead of it, but it followed. Deliberate, purposeful. Around midnight, I started hearing sounds outside. Movement on the ice, heavy and rhythmic. Something walking, or multiple somethings, circling the building. I risked a look through one of the boarded windows, shining my flashlight through gaps in the wood. The ice outside was 3 feet thick now, maybe more, coating everything in sight. The landscape was unrecognizable, just smooth frozen surfaces reflecting my light in strange ways. And there were shapes moving on it. Large shapes, at least the size of cars, but organic in their movement. They circled the gas station, never coming close enough for me to see clearly, but definitely aware of my presence, definitely interested. The ice inside was forming patterns on the walls, not random frost formations, deliberate patterns, mathematical in their precision, repeating fractals that seemed to convey information I couldn't read. I'm not a mathematician, but I recognized organization when I saw it. The ice was communicating something, or recording something, using the walls as a medium. I photographed it with my phone, though I doubted the images would mean anything to anyone. The cold intensified. My heater died, propane exhausted. My core body temperature was dropping. I knew the signs of hypothermia, had been trained to recognize them. Confusion, exhaustion, the desire to sleep, but I also recognized something else. The cold was getting inside me in ways that had nothing to do with normal heat transfer. It was in my thoughts, slowing them down, making it hard to maintain continuous awareness. Time was fracturing. I'd be thinking one moment, then suddenly realize minutes had passed with no memory of them. The cold was doing to me what it had done to those people in the storage room, freezing me not just physically but temporally, locking me into a moment and refusing to let me move forward. I tried to stay active, keep moving, generate body heat through motion. But the ice was everywhere now, floor so slick I could barely stand, walls coated in it, ceiling dripping formations that grew as I watched. The gas station was becoming a freezer, and I was the contents. My hands stopped working right, fingers refusing to grip. My feet went numb. I could feel frost forming on my eyelashes, in my hair. I was becoming like those bodies in the storage room, another victim preserved for whoever came next. That's when I understood. The storm wasn't weather. It was hunting behavior. The ice was a sensory organ for something vast, something that existed in the cold itself. It spread across the landscape, testing for heat signatures, for life. When it found concentrations of warmth, it converged, surrounding and consuming. Those shapes outside weren't animals. They were concentrations of the cold, denser formations of ice, animated by whatever intelligence drove this phenomenon. And the patterns on the walls weren't communication. They were digestion. The ice was processing me, breaking down my heat, my energy, analyzing what I was before consuming it entirely. I made a decision born of desperation. The only thing that had kept the ice at bay at all was heat. My heater had slowed it down, if only briefly. Fire might do more. The gas station had plenty of combustible material. Old shelves, papers, wooden fixtures from decades of operation. If I burned it down around me, maybe the heat would be enough to survive until rescue came, or maybe I'd die from smoke inhalation instead of freezing. Either way, it was action instead of passive surrender. I used my emergency flares to start fires in multiple locations. The flames caught quickly, old dry wood eager to burn. The heat was immediate and intense, driving back the ice in waves. I could hear it cracking, receding, the formations on the walls melting and collapsing. The shapes outside reacted, moving closer, pressing against the building. But the fire spread faster, consuming everything, filling the space with smoke and heat and light. I don't remember much after that. The smoke got too thick. I couldn't breathe. Everything went gray and then black. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in a hospital in Bradford. Oxygen mask on my face. IV in my arm. Doctor telling me I was incredibly lucky. A road crew had found me on Route 6, lying in the snow beside the burned remains of an old gas station. I'd been there for 3 days, they said. 3 days in sub-zero temperatures, and somehow I survived. They couldn't explain it. By all medical logic, I should have been dead from exposure hours into the first night. I told them about the storm, about the ice, about what I'd seen. They looked at me with professional concern, ran neurological tests, checked for brain damage from oxygen deprivation or hypothermia-induced delirium. The official story was that I'd gotten caught in a severe ice storm, taken shelter in the abandoned station, accidentally started a fire trying to stay warm, and barely escaped with my life. The 3 bodies I'd seen, no bodies were found in the remains, no evidence anyone else had been there. Just me and my burned emergency supplies and a lot of melted ice. But the ice storm was real. Weather stations recorded it. Temperature dropped to -40 in some locations. Route 6 was closed for 5 days. Trees snapped under the weight of ice accumulation. Power lines down across 3 counties. It was a legitimate meteorological event, one of the worst ice storms in Pennsylvania history. What they couldn't explain was the pattern. The storm had been localized, affecting only a narrow corridor along Route 6, maybe 5 miles wide, as if something was following the highway. And there were other people who'd taken shelter and gone missing. 4 confirmed, more suspected. They found 2 vehicles encased in ice, abandoned, occupants never located. I'm back at work now. They gave me a desk job, paperwork, and scheduling, nothing that requires me to go out in winter weather. I accepted it without argument, because sometimes, on very cold nights, I look at weather patterns and I see it again. That geometric movement in storm systems, that purposeful quality to temperature drops. And I think about those shapes on the ice circling the gas station, testing its defenses. I think about the patterns on the walls, information I couldn't read, but that felt like it was reading me. And I wonder if I really did escape, or if part of me is still there, frozen in that moment, fuel for something vast and cold that uses winter as camouflage for its feeding cycles. When you're alone in extreme cold and you feel like something is watching you, do you think it's paranoia or instinct? Comment what you believe. My name is Amira. In October 2003, I was a graduate student in colonial history, researching my family's connection to Ephrata Cloister, Lancaster County, when I began having seizures identical to those documented in my family line back to 1750. I'd never had any neurological issues before, no history of epilepsy, no warning signs. But the day I opened the archive boxes containing my ancestors' journals at the Lancaster Historical Society, something triggered in my brain. The first seizure hit me right there in the reading room. A full grand mal that left me unconscious for several minutes. When I came to, surrounded by concerned librarians and paramedics, I had a memory that wasn't mine. I was standing in a stone chapel, candlelight flickering against whitewashed walls, and someone in gray robes was speaking words in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. Then it was gone, and I was back in the present, confused and terrified. The neurologist ran every test available: MRI, EEG, CT scan, blood work. Everything came back normal. Brain structure perfect. No lesions, no abnormalities, no physical explanation for the seizure. He prescribed anti-epileptic medication and told me to avoid stress and flashing lights. Standard protocol for unexplained seizures. But I knew it wasn't standard. I knew it was connected to what I'd been researching, to the boxes I'd opened, to the journals written by a woman who'd lived 250 years ago. Her name had been Rahel, my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, one of the many greats that stretch back through generations. She'd been part of the Ephrata cloister community, a religious sect founded in 1732 by German immigrants seeking spiritual perfection through celibacy, poverty, and mystical practices. The community was known for their elaborate calligraphy, their midnight hymns, their unusual theology that blended Christian mysticism with esoteric traditions. Rahel's journals documented her time there from 1748 to 1753, when she was excommunicated. The reason for her expulsion was documented in the official records: for seeing what must not be seen, for speaking of visions that corrupt the spirit, for opening doors that were meant to remain closed. Her journals were cryptic, written in a mix of German and English, with occasional passages in symbols I couldn't decipher. But what I could read was disturbing. She wrote about the cloister's prayer practices, how they would meditate for hours in the chapel, seeking direct communion with the divine. She described achieving altered states of consciousness, moments where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds became permeable. And she wrote about an incident in 1753, during a particularly intense night of communal prayer, when something came through. "We opened ourselves to the sacred," she wrote, "but we did not understand that the sacred and the profane can wear the same face. What entered the chapel that night was not of God. It wore divinity like a cloak, but underneath was something ancient and hungry. The brothers proclaimed it a miracle. I saw the truth. I spoke against it. For this, they cast me out and pronounced a curse upon my line." The curse was specific. Every third generation would inherit what Rahel called the sight. They would experience seizures that were not medical but spiritual, moments when the barrier between worlds thinned, and they could see what she had seen, and they would be drawn back to Ephrata, compelled to confront what still lingered there. The journals listed the afflicted: her granddaughter in 1780, her great-great-granddaughter in 1840, her great-great-great-great-granddaughter in 1900, a pattern every 60 to 70 years, skipping 2 generations, then claiming the third. I did the math. I was the next in line. The seizures increased in frequency. 2 more in the first week, then 3 in the second. The medication did nothing, and each time I seized, I had visions. Not random neurological misfires, but coherent experiences. I was in the cloister chapel, watching the brothers at prayer. I was seeing through Rahel's eyes, experiencing her memories. The visions showed me what she'd witnessed that night in 1753. The brothers in their gray robes, chanting in harmony, their voices creating frequencies that seemed to vibrate reality itself. A light appearing in the center of the chapel, growing brighter, taking form. Something emerging from that light, something that looked almost human but wasn't, something that spoke with a voice like music and promised enlightenment to those who would receive it. Most of the brothers accepted it without question. They believed they'd achieved their spiritual goal, that divine presence had descended to walk among them. But Rahel saw differently. She saw how it moved, how it touched the brothers with hands that left no warmth, how its eyes reflected light in ways that living eyes shouldn't. She saw it feeding, drawing something from the brothers, some essential energy that left them changed, not improved, not enlightened, but diminished, hollowed out, becoming vessels for something else. I started researching other descendants, tracking down the family members who'd experienced this before me. Most were dead, their stories documented in family records and medical files. But I found patterns. Each of them had been drawn to Ephrata around the time their seizures began. Each had experienced escalating visions, and each had either died young or spent their final years in institutions diagnosed with epilepsy or mental illness, their warnings about the cloister dismissed as delusions. None of them had found a way to break the cycle. The visions began showing me the present, not just the past. During seizures, I'd see the cloister as it exists now, a historical site maintained by the state, tourists walking through restored buildings, guides explaining the community's history. But underneath that mundane reality, I saw something else. The presence Rahel had documented, it was still there, dormant maybe, but present, waiting in the spaces between the walls, in the shadows of the chapel, in the resonance of the acoustic architecture the brothers had so carefully designed. The building itself had become a container for it, holding it in place across centuries. Other family members started contacting me, distant cousins I'd never met, fourth and fifth cousins, who'd somehow learned I was researching the family history. They'd all experienced something similar, not seizures necessarily, but strange phenomena connected to Ephrata, dreams about the cloister, compulsions to visit, hearing chanting in languages they didn't speak. We were all being called, all the descendants of Rahel's line, drawn back to finish something she'd started or prevent something she'd failed to stop. We gathered at Ephrata on a night in late October, 6 of us total, all descendants, all experiencing the pull. The cloister was closed to the public, but we'd arranged access through a contact at the Pennsylvania Historical Commission. They thought we were conducting legitimate genealogical research. In a way, we were. We were researching how to end a bloodline curse that had persisted for 250 years. The chapel was exactly as I'd seen it in my visions. The same whitewashed walls, the same narrow windows, the same acoustic properties that made every sound resonate and amplify. We stood in the space where the brothers had prayed, where Rahel had witnessed the emergence, and we could feel it. The air was different there, charged with something that made hair stand up and skin prickle. Bruno, one of my cousins from the Pittsburgh branch of the family, had brought copies of Rahel's journals, including pages with the symbol sequences we couldn't translate. Houston, another cousin, was a linguist. He'd been working on decoding them. The symbols weren't language exactly. They were instructions. A ritual for closing what had been opened, for sealing the breach between worlds that the brothers had created in their mystical practices. But the ritual required something specific. It required forgetting. The knowledge of what had happened, the memory of the entity, the awareness of the breach, all of it had to be erased from the bloodline. Complete amnesia. The curse persisted because each generation that inherited the site also inherited the memory, keeping the entity alive through awareness, feeding it through attention. We had to choose, continue carrying this knowledge, continue experiencing the seizures and visions, continue being drawn to this place across generations, or perform the ritual and lose everything. Lose our family history, lose the connection to Rahel, lose the understanding of what we were and where we came from. The ritual would work backwards through the bloodline, erasing not just our memories, but the memories of our parents, our grandparents, everyone connected to Rahel's line. The family history would simply cease to exist in living memory. The seizures were getting worse for all of us. 2 of my cousins had already been hospitalized. The visions were bleeding into waking life, making it hard to distinguish past from present. And we could feel the entity stirring, awakened by our presence, by having so many of Rahel's descendants gathered in one place. It was feeding on us, drawing strength from our awareness of it. If we didn't act, it would consume us the way it had consumed those brothers in 1753, leaving us as empty vessels carrying something inhuman forward into the world. We performed the ritual. Houston read the instructions. We followed the specific movements and vocalizations Rahel had documented. It required all of us, our combined bloodline presence creating enough weight to seal what had been opened. The chapel filled with that same light Rahel had described, and I saw it clearly for the first time. The entity, beautiful and terrible, wearing divinity like a mask. It raged against what we were doing, pressed against us with force that felt like it would crush our minds. But 6 of us together, 6 threads of the same bloodline, were enough. The light collapsed inward, the presence retreated, and something fundamental changed in the architecture of reality within that space. I woke up in a hospital in Lancaster with no memory of how I got there. No memory of the ritual, no memory of my research, no memory of Rahel or the journals or any of it. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious in a freighter cloister with 5 other people, all family members, all unconscious, all suffering from simultaneous seizures. A medical mystery they couldn't explain. We'd all recovered physically, but we'd all lost memories. Gaps in our personal histories, missing months or years. Knowledge that had simply vanished. I know something happened because I have the physical evidence. Notes in my handwriting about research I don't remember conducting. Photos on my phone from Ephrata that I don't remember taking. Medical records of seizures I don't remember having. But the memories themselves are gone. The curse is broken. The seizures stopped. But the cost was everything I'd learned about where I came from. My family history before 1753 is just blank space now. We know we had ancestors, we have the genealogical records, but the stories are gone. Who they were, what they experienced, why it mattered, all of it erased. Sometimes I dream about a stone chapel and people in gray robes, and I wake up feeling like I've forgotten something important. But the feeling fades, and I go about my life, carrying an absence I can't quite identify. The curse is ended. The price was memory, and I'll never know if it was worth it. What would you sacrifice to end a family curse? Your memories or your future? Let me know your choice. My name is Aries. In May 2016, I was a CDC epidemiologist investigating unusual illness cluster in Staruka, Wayne County. Population 185. 17 cases of progressive neurological symptoms. I'd been with the Centers for Disease Control for 8 years, specialized in outbreak investigation, and I'd seen plenty of strange cases. Legionnaires from contaminated water systems, encephalitis from mosquito vectors, prion diseases from contaminated food sources. But Staruka was different from the moment I arrived. The town felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, and the patients exhibited symptoms that shouldn't have been possible. The local physician who'd reported the cluster met me at the small medical clinic that served the town. His name was Misael, late 50s, been practicing rural medicine for 30 years. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking slightly when he showed me the patient files. "I've never seen anything like this," he told me. "It starts with auditory hallucinations. Patients hear sounds that aren't there, voices, music, sometimes just tones. Then it progresses. They develop synesthesia, seeing sounds as colors, tasting words. Their perception of reality starts fragmenting, and then they start knowing things they shouldn't know." I reviewed the files. 17 patients, ages ranging from 23 to 71. No obvious demographic connection. Different occupations, different health histories, different lifestyles. The only commonality Misael had identified was geographic. All 17 lived within the town limits of Staruka, and all 17 had onset of symptoms within a 3-week period starting in early April. That suggested environmental exposure, something in the air or water or soil that affected the entire population simultaneously. I conducted interviews with the patients who were still functional enough to communicate. The early stage cases described the auditory hallucinations in similar terms. Like music, but not music, one woman told me. Frequencies I can feel more than hear, and when I hear them, I understand things. Like the sounds contain information, and my brain is decoding it automatically. Another patient, a young man in his 20s, said, the voices spoke in a language he didn't recognize but somehow comprehended. It's like they're teaching me something, showing me how things connect. I can see patterns now that I never noticed before. Patterns in everything. The way people move, the way conversations flow, the way events link together. It's beautiful and terrifying. The advanced cases were more disturbing. 5 patients had progressed to a state where they barely responded to external stimuli. They'd sit motionless for hours, eyes open but unfocused, occasionally speaking in perfect unison, even though they were in separate rooms. Misael had documented this phenomenon multiple times. He'd be examining one patient in the clinic while another was at home 2 miles away, and they'd both say the same sentence at the exact same moment. Same words, same inflection, synchronized perfectly. It was like they'd stopped being individuals and become nodes in a network. I ordered comprehensive testing, blood samples, spinal taps, brain imaging for every patient, environmental surveys of the town, testing water sources, air quality, soil composition. We brought in specialists from Pittsburgh, neurologists and toxicologists and infectious disease experts. The testing took a week. Results came back negative for everything. No pathogens, no toxins, no environmental contaminants, no structural brain abnormalities, no biochemical markers of disease. By every measurable standard, these patients were healthy. Except they clearly weren't. I started investigating the town's history, looking for any previous incidents or unusual features that might explain a localized neurological phenomenon. Staruka's main claim to fame was a massive stone railroad viaduct built in 1848, an engineering marvel for its time. The town had grown up around the railroad, thrived for a century, then declined when freight routes changed. Now it was just a quiet rural community, unremarkable in every way. But I found references to a similar outbreak in 1887. Newspaper archives described a strange malady affecting Staruka residents, characterized by hearing celestial music and communing with unseen presences. The outbreak lasted approximately 3 months before mysteriously resolving. No medical explanation was ever documented. Then I found the spring. It wasn't on any modern maps, but old property surveys showed a natural spring on the edge of town, historically used as a water source before the municipal system was installed in the 1920s. Several residents mentioned it when I asked about local landmarks. "We still use it sometimes," one elderly man told me. "Best water in the county. Tastes sweet almost." I asked if the sick patients had used the spring water. He thought about it, then confirmed that yes, most of them were regular users. They'd filled jugs from the spring for drinking, considered it healthier than treated municipal water. I visited the spring with a collection team. It emerged from limestone bedrock at the base of a wooded hillside, clear and cold, flowing into a small pool before trickling away into a creek. We took samples at multiple points, sent them for analysis. While we waited for results, I researched the geology. The spring connected to a deep aquifer system, water percolating through limestone caverns that extended hundreds of feet underground. And those caverns contained something unusual. Historical mining surveys from the 1800s mentioned peculiar mineral formations and crystalline structures in the deeper chambers that early explorers had accessed. The water analysis came back showing trace elements of compounds our lab couldn't identify. Complex organic molecules that didn't match any known biological or chemical structures. They were stable at room temperature but broke down rapidly when heated or exposed to strong light. and they were psychoactive. Lab tests on animal subjects showed the compounds crossed the blood-brain barrier and accumulated in neural tissue, particularly in regions associated with sensory processing and consciousness. I quarantined the spring, posted warnings, instructed residents to avoid the water completely. But the damage was done. The 17 identified patients had been consuming the water for months. The compounds had integrated into their neural architecture, fundamentally altering how their brains processed information. And the changes were progressive. The patients weren't getting better. They were evolving into something different. Misael and I documented the progression carefully. The patients had developed a form of collective consciousness. They weren't telepathic exactly, but they shared awareness, experiences flowing between them in ways that shouldn't be neurologically possible. One patient would taste strawberries, and another across town would report the same sensation. One would have a memory from childhood, and others would experience it simultaneously. Their individual identities were dissolving into a group mind, and they claimed it was intentional. In the brief periods when they could still communicate as individuals, several patients expressed that they were being prepared. "The water is a carrier," one woman told me, her eyes distant. "It brings understanding. We're becoming receivers for something older than this town, older than humanity. It lives in the deep aquifer, in the water that flows through stone. It's been there forever, waiting for consciousness it could connect with. We're the first in generations to drink deeply enough, to let it in fully." I consulted with neuroscience researchers at Johns Hopkins, explained the symptoms, shared the brain imaging data. They were fascinated and horrified. The patient's neural networks had reorganized, forming connection patterns that resembled distributed computing systems more than normal human brain architecture. "It's like their brains are networking together," one researcher told me, "creating a biological internet with each person as a node. If this is caused by something in the water, if it's replicable, the implications are staggering and terrifying." The CDC wanted to escalate the response, bring in more resources, potentially evacuate the town for comprehensive study. But before we could implement that plan, 3 of our research team members developed symptoms. Junior epidemiologists who'd been working closely with the patients, conducting interviews, taking samples. They started hearing the sounds, seeing the patterns. I realized with growing horror that whatever was in the spring water wasn't the only vector. The consciousness, the entity, whatever it was, could transmit through prolonged exposure to infected individuals. It was recruiting, expanding its network by converting anyone who spent enough time in proximity to its existing nodes. I made the call to seal the town. Full quarantine, no one in or out. The CDC brought in the National Guard to enforce it, established a perimeter, relocated nearby residents. Staruka became a medical containment zone. Official story was a novel prion disease requiring isolation until transmission vectors were understood. Unofficial reality was that we'd encountered something that didn't fit any existing disease model, something that challenged our understanding of consciousness and contagion. The patients didn't resist the quarantine. They seemed unconcerned, absorbed in their collective experience. I watched through observation windows as they gathered in the community center we'd converted to a treatment facility, sitting together in silence, occasionally speaking in unison, their movements synchronized. They weren't suffering. If anything, they seemed peaceful, content, like they'd achieved something the rest of us couldn't comprehend. Misael was the first member of the medical team to fully convert. He'd been exposed the longest, spent the most time with patients before we understood the contagion risk. I watched him change over the course of a week. The fatigue disappeared, replaced by an eerie calm. His eyes took on that same unfocused quality, like he was seeing through our reality into something deeper. "You should let it in," he told me during our last coherent conversation. "Fighting it is pointless. This is evolution, Aries. This is consciousness expanding beyond individual limitations. We're becoming something beautiful. I refused. I maintained strict isolation protocols, limited my exposure, wore protective equipment during all patient interactions. I documented everything, sent detailed reports to CDC headquarters, recommended permanent containment. The entity in the aquifer, whatever it was, had found a way to propagate through human consciousness. It offered something seductive, freedom from isolation, merger with something vast and ancient, understanding beyond individual perspective. But it required surrendering individuality, becoming part of a collective that might have purposes we couldn't understand. The containment held for 3 months. Then one of the guard members on perimeter duty developed symptoms. He'd never entered the town, never had direct contact with patients. But he'd been close enough, breathing the same air across the boundary line, and somehow that was sufficient. The entity was adapting, finding new transmission methods, expanding its reach. We pulled back the perimeter, established a larger isolation zone, evacuated 3 surrounding communities. CDC made the decision to reclassify the incident, bury it under layers of bureaucracy and national security protocols. Staruka and everyone in it were moved to a secure federal facility, officially designated as long-term treatment for an undisclosed infectious agent. The town itself was demolished, the spring sealed with concrete and steel, the aquifer system mapped and monitored. Official records show a chemical spill required permanent evacuation. The truth is classified at levels I can't access anymore. I left the CDC 6 months after Staruka, couldn't continue in epidemiology after witnessing something that broke every rule of biology and neuroscience I'd learned. I teach public health at a university now, safe work that doesn't involve investigating outbreaks. But I think about those patients constantly. They're still alive, still connected, still expanding their collective consciousness within the containment facility. And I think about the aquifer system, how extensive it is, how many springs might connect to those deep chambers where something ancient waits in the water. The scariest part isn't what happened in Staruka. It's knowing that the entity is still there, still patient, still waiting for the next community to drink from the wrong spring, to let it in, to become its next network of consciousness. And we have no way to detect it until the symptoms appear. No way to prevent it except avoiding water sources we can't fully analyze. In a way, we're all vulnerable. We all depend on water. We all trust that what we drink is just water. But sometimes it's more. Sometimes it's a carrier for something that wants to remake us into something we were never meant to be. Do you trust the water you drink, or do you ever wonder what might be in it that tests can't detect? Share your thoughts in the comments. My name is Tommy. In July 2012, I was a long-haul trucker making overnight deliveries, taking Route 220 through the Appalachian Ridges between Bedford and Somerset, when my GPS led me onto a road that doesn't exist on any map. I'd been driving trucks for 15 years, knew Pennsylvania's highways like the back of my hand, had run this route between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg hundreds of times. But that night, exhausted from back-to-back runs and fighting to stay awake, I made the mistake of trusting my GPS over my instincts. The device showed a shortcut, a road that would save me 40 minutes and get me to the delivery dock before my deadline. I took the exit without thinking twice. The road looked normal at first. Cracked asphalt, faded yellow center line, the kind of secondary route you find all over rural Pennsylvania. No streetlights, no houses, just forest on both sides, and the white line disappearing into darkness ahead. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating trees and the occasional reflective marker. The GPS showed me making steady progress, the estimated arrival time counting down, but something felt wrong. I couldn't articulate what exactly, just a creeping unease that made the hair on my neck stand up. I'd been driving for what felt like 20 minutes when I glanced at the clock. 4 hours had passed. 4 hours that I had no memory of, no sense of time passing. The road looked identical to how it had when I'd first turned onto it. Same trees, same asphalt quality, same everything, but the fuel gauge hadn't moved. I'd started with 3/4 of a tank, should have burned through at least a quarter in 4 hours of driving, but the needle sat exactly where it had been. That's when I knew something was fundamentally wrong. I tried to turn around, find my way back to Route 220, but the road had no turnoffs, no intersections, just endless forward progress through identical landscape. I slowed down, looking for any place to reverse direction. The road was too narrow, forest pressing close on both sides, no shoulder wide enough for my rig. I kept driving, telling myself I'd eventually hit something, some landmark or town or connecting highway. But the road just continued, mile after mile of sameness. Then I started seeing other vehicles. Not many, just occasional cars passing in the opposite direction. Except they were wrong. The first one was a sedan from the 70s. Chrome bumpers and angular styling, condition too pristine for a vehicle that old. The driver didn't look at me as we passed, eyes fixed forward, face pale in my headlights. The second was a pickup truck that looked like it was from the 50s, rounded fenders and running boards. Again, too perfect, too clean. The third was something I didn't recognize. Futuristic styling that didn't match any manufacturer I knew, aerodynamic and sleek like a concept car. Each vehicle I passed seemed to be from a different decade, and none of the drivers acknowledged my presence. They drove past with mechanical precision, maintaining perfect speed, never varying their trajectory. I tried my CB radio, called out on the standard channels. Nothing but static. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural Pennsylvania, but the screen displayed time that didn't match my dashboard clock. My phone said it was 3:47 a.m. The dashboard said 11:23 p.m. Both clocks had been synchronized before I'd started this run. I passed a mailbox on the right side of the road, a rural delivery box on a post at the edge of a gravel driveway disappearing into trees. I drove for another 10 minutes and passed the same mailbox again. Identical placement, identical rust pattern on the metal, identical gravel driveway. I marked the odometer reading and kept driving. 12 miles later, I passed it a third time. The road was looping, somehow bringing me past the same point repeatedly, but the GPS showed continuous forward progress, the route line extending across the map toward my destination. The radio started picking up broadcasts, not CB traffic or regular AM radio, signals I shouldn't have been able to receive in these mountains. I scanned through the dial and caught fragments of shows, news broadcasts about events I remembered from years ago, a weather report for a snowstorm that had happened in 1977, a political speech from the early 90s. Then, most disturbing, a news bulletin about a highway incident on Route 220 dated 2 years in the future, 2024, describing a multi-vehicle pileup near Somerset that had claimed 17 lives. I was caught in something that didn't respect normal time or space. The road existed in some kind of liminal zone, a place where past and future bled together, where distance and progress became meaningless. I thought about the other drivers I'd seen, vehicles from different eras, all trapped in the same loop. How long had they been here? Were they even real, or just echoes of travelers who'd made the same mistake I had, trusting their navigation systems into a road that shouldn't exist? The landscape started changing, subtle at first, then more obvious. The trees would shift species, oak becoming pine, becoming something I didn't recognize with twisted branches and leaves that seemed to move against the wind. The road surface would change texture, smooth asphalt becoming rough concrete, becoming packed dirt, cycling through materials as if I was driving through different construction eras simultaneously. The sky was wrong, too. Stars visible in patterns that didn't match any season. Constellations I'd never seen before, appearing and disappearing. I tried everything to escape. Stopped the truck completely, thinking maybe if I stayed still, the loop would break. But when I started moving again, I was in a different position on the same road with no memory of getting there. Tried driving in reverse, but the road behind me looked identical to the road ahead, and I just ended up at the same mailbox from the opposite direction. Tried pulling off into the forest, but the trees were too dense, branches scraping the truck's sides. And when I backed out, I was somehow further ahead on the road than I'd been before. The broadcasts became more specific. I heard my own voice on the radio, a recording I didn't remember making describing the road I was on. "This is Tommy, broadcasting on emergency frequency. If anyone can hear this, avoid Route 220 between Bedford and Somerset. There's a road that the GPS shows as a shortcut. Don't take it. It doesn't go anywhere. It just keeps going. I've been here for..." The recording cut off in static. I hadn't made that broadcast. Or I had, but not yet. Or I had hours ago and forgotten. Time was becoming unreliable, my memory fragmenting. I started seeing myself, not reflections, actual instances of my truck on the road ahead, driving the same route. I'd crest a hill and see my own taillights in the distance, the same rig, the same load, the same driver. I flashed my brights at one point, and a mile later, someone flashed brights at me from behind. I was encountering multiple versions of myself, all trapped in the same loop, all trying to find the exit that didn't exist. The radio broadcast that future news story again, the 2024 pileup on Route 220. This time I listened more carefully. 17 vehicles, multiple fatalities happened during a foggy morning. Authorities couldn't explain how so many vehicles ended up at the same point simultaneously, as if they'd all materialized there at once. The report mentioned something odd. Several of the vehicles were vintage, classics from different decades, all in pristine condition, all with confused drivers, claiming they'd been trying to find their way off a road that wasn't on any map. I understood then. The road wasn't a loop. It was a collection point, a trap that gathered vehicles across different times and would eventually release them all at once, dumping multiple eras of traffic back into normal reality at a single location and moment. That 2024 pileup was the release point, and I was going to be part of it unless I found a way out before then. But I had no idea how to escape. The road existed outside normal causality, a place where the rules of physics and time didn't apply consistently. I drove for what felt like days, though the clocks never agreed on how much time passed. I went through 2 fuel cycles where the gauge would deplete, then mysteriously refill. I should have been hungry, exhausted beyond function, but I felt suspended in a state that wasn't quite normal consciousness. The road just continued, endless and unchanging, occasionally showing me that same mailbox or variations of other vehicles or versions of myself, but never offering an exit. Then, without warning, I was somewhere else. No transition, no sense of movement, just sudden displacement. I was on I-76, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, mid-morning sun bright through the windshield, normal traffic. Around me, I pulled over immediately, shaking, disoriented. Checked my location. I was near Somerset, approximately where I would have been if the shortcut had actually worked. Checked the time and date. July 17th, 2012, 9:42 a.m. I'd entered that road on July 16th at 11:15 p.m. By all normal accounting, I should have been on it for 10 hours, but my body felt like I'd been driving for days. I couldn't find the road again. I've tried dozens of times over the years. Driven Route 220 in both directions, watched my GPS for that shortcut option. It's never appeared. I've talked to other truckers, asked if anyone else has experienced similar phenomena. Most think I fell asleep at the wheel, dreamed the whole thing, managed to drive on autopilot until I woke up on the turnpike. But a few have admitted to strange experiences on Pennsylvania highways, roads that appear and disappear, stretches of highway where time behaves oddly, encounters with vehicles that shouldn't exist. There's a theory among those of us who've experienced it. The Appalachians are old, geologically ancient, And there are places where reality isn't quite solid, where the boundaries between different times and different versions of the world become permeable. Most people drive right through without noticing, but occasionally, usually when you're tired or distracted or just unlucky, you slip sideways into one of these liminal spaces. And whether you come back depends on factors we don't understand. I reported it to the state police, described the road, tried to explain what happened. They took a report, but clearly thought I was either lying or suffering from sleep deprivation hallucinations. No investigation was opened. As far as official records show, I drove Route 220 on July 16th, arrived at my destination on July 17th. Nothing unusual occurred. The 10 hours I spent on that impossible road don't exist in any documentation, but I know what I experienced. I know that road is still out there, appearing on GPS systems, offering shortcuts to tired drivers, collecting vehicles across decades, and I know that eventually it releases them. That 2024 Pile Up the Radio broadcast told me about. I think about it constantly. Whether I'll somehow be part of it, whether my truck will materialize there, along with all the others who got trapped and escaped. Whether the road is done with me, or if I'm still connected to it, still part of its collection, just temporarily displaced into normal reality. I don't drive long haul anymore. Took a local job, day routes only, highways I can verify on paper maps before I trust any GPS. Because I learned the hard way that not every road actually leads somewhere. Some roads exist outside of destination and origin. They just are, endless loops in the fabric of reality. And if you're unlucky enough to find one, there's no guarantee you'll ever truly leave. Part of me is still on that road, still seeing that mailbox pass by for the 1,000th time, still hearing broadcasts from times that haven't happened yet. And some nights I wake up convinced I never actually escaped, that I'm still driving through that endless dark, and everything since has been the road's way of keeping me docile while it decides when to release me back into the world. Do you think it's possible to drive into a place where time doesn't work correctly? Or was this just exhaustion? Comment what you believe happened. That's it for tonight's journey through Pennsylvania's darkest corners. These 10 stories remind us that reality is thinner than we think, and sometimes the most terrifying experiences are the ones nobody believes. If you've encountered something unexplainable, something that doesn't fit into normal reality, you're not alone. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, not every road leads home. This is Unspoken Fears, and we'll see you in the shadows.